The life of pro wrestling embodies the soaring highs and tragic lows of fame. Many wrestlers go their entire career without ever even sniffing a spotlight, but for the select few who are able to achieve stardom, they have many men who came before them to thank for paving that road. The Japanese pro wrestling scene is a very different one from what most Westerners are used to. Had it not been for an immigrant who rose from post-war poverty to become Japan's first nationally celebrated wrestling star. With his heroic storylines, athleticism, and charisma, he gained unmatched popularity in the 1950s and would go on to become known as the father of Puroresu as we know it. Born Kim Sinrak in 1924, his ethnic Korean parents raised him in humble circumstances in his birth city of Kimcheon. From a young age, Rikidozan trained in the traditional Korean sport of Siram wrestling, developing the athleticism and tenacity that would serve him well later in the ring. In his late teens, like many Koreans at the time, Rikidozan migrated to Japan seeking better opportunities. There he is said to have worked a series of manual labor jobs in the late 1930s and early 1940s while training as a weightlifter in his spare time. Already a naturally muscular guy, the weightlifting further enhanced his powerful build, and he was noticed for this even in his youth. Details from this period of Rikidozan's youth are few and far between, but some accounts point to his attitude and aggressive demeanor getting him into scraps on the streets. Perhaps this fighting pointed him toward the path of professional wrestling. In the early 1940s, he joined Japan's harsh sumo wrestling system for a brief stint that awakened his passion for athletics. Rikidozan first made a name for himself in the world of sumo wrestling after he moved to Japan as a teenager to pursue a career in the national sport. Rikidozan was relatively small for a sumo wrestler, but made up for it with incredible speed and agility. In June 1940, Kim joined the prestigious Nishonnoseki stable and made his debut in professional sumo wrestling. However, his Korean heritage was listed publicly on ranking sheets, opening him up to intense harassment and racism within the Japanese-dominated sport. To shield him, the stablemaster Momoda adopted Kim and gave him the Japanese name Mitsuhiro Momoda. A fictional backstory was crafted that Kim had been born not in Korea but in the Japanese town of Omura, Nagasaki. This name and origin change still did not grant Kim full acceptance. Despite shedding his Korean identity, he continued facing discrimination and only attained Japanese citizenship in 1951 after over a decade in sumo. Kim's experience revealed the harsh barriers facing minorities in Japan within the country's national sport. Though he tried assimilation, truly being seen as an equal would remain elusive at this time. He rose rapidly through the rankings. However, Rikidozan grew dissatisfied with the rigid lifestyle and training regimen of sumo. After less than 2 years in the harsh world of sumo wrestling, he pivoted to the more exciting realm of professional wrestling. Rikidozan made his professional wrestling debut in 1951. And over the next several years, he steadily built his reputation with matches across Japan against visiting American stars. His style captivated Japanese audiences who had never seen pro wrestling like this before. He was one of the first men to ever bring the more Americanized version of wrestling to Japan, and his many wins over the many evil foreigners would become a formula companies would use for decades after to build their top stars. In the case of Rikidozan, it worked wonders, and he became as big of a star as there had ever been. In 1953, Rikidozan would elect to begin an organization that would be the Japanese affiliate of the National Wrestling Alliance. At the time, the National Wrestling Alliance was a huge governing body over most of pro wrestling, and Riki saw this as an opportunity to get more international recognition for Japan and boost his own name at the same time. On December 22, 1954, in one of his most famous bouts, after years of the two teaming against the Sharp brothers in front of packed houses, Rikidozan defeated his longtime partner Masahiko Kimura to win the Japan Heavyweight Championship in its one and only time it was ever contested. During the bout, Kimura and Rikidozan began in what most would consider a traditional wrestling bout. But slowly it would devolve into a shoot and result in Rikidozan knocking out his opponent. This cemented his status as the biggest star in Japanese pro wrestling at the time. Over the next 7 years, Rikidozan engaged in epic rivalries with American legends with whom he traded the NWA International Heavyweight Championship in title matches in both Japan and the States. He also feuded with stars like Freddie Blassie, Dick the Bruiser, and Destroyer. Along with his accolades in the ring, outside the ring, Rikidozan became a major celebrity in Japan, rubbing shoulders with politicians and mobsters. This didn't seem out of place at the time, as many celebrities would have some mob connections even stateside, but this would be something that would later be a large contributor to his demise. At the peak of his fame, Rikidozan would have an unfortunate encounter with a low-level gangster in a Tokyo nightclub on December 8, 1963, the man named Katsushi Murata. Katsushi Murata was born in the mid-1930s in Japan and became involved with the Ninkyo Dantai, also known as Yakuza, Japanese organized crime syndicate, as a young man. By the early 1960s, Murata was a low-ranking member of the gangster underworld, though details of his early life are sparse. On the night of the ill-fated encounter, there is much speculation as to why these two would encounter one another. Many speculate it was ordered by the Yakuza over disputes involving Rikidozan's wrestling promotion, but with little corroboration, the version most go with is as follows. Rikidozan had been drinking with friends in Tokyo's New Latin Quarter Club, an upscale bar and nightclub. Later, while enjoying the evening and trying to chat up, a woman Rikidozan alleged that Murata stepped on his shoe and demanded an apology. Murata refused, and the two began to argue, with Murata pulling out a knife from his belt, which Rikidozan saw and said, "I understand, let's make up, I apologize." Murata declined this apology, and Rikidozan punched Murata in the face, knocking him against a wall. Rikidozan then mounted Murata and continued to punch him on the ground until Murata stabbed Rikidozan once in the abdomen. Murata stabbed Japanese professional wrestling icon Rikidozan with a urine-dipped knife and immediately fled from pursuers and those tending to Rikidozan. Dozan would be taken to Sano Hospital due to him knowing one of the doctors and hopefully being able to keep the whole thing out of the newspapers. The doctor would be able to tend to the wound minimally, but was able to diagnose the wound as a non-fatal one, but highly recommended that Rikidozan get himself surgery as soon as he was able. While this was happening, word had got back to the Tokon Gosai, who were a gang closely associated to Rikidozan, of the stabbing, and retribution was on their minds. Within a short time, they had tracked down and attacked Murata to such a degree, he too was hospitalized with several injuries. Rikidozan was able to get surgery and was released from the hospital in hopes of him being able to make a full recovery, but he was given strict orders to abstain from drinking. Rikidozan was in the clubs that very day and was drinking up just as he always had been. His ignorance of the consequences, coupled with a burning desire to project an image of invincibility, ultimately led to his downfall. During this period of time, in the following days, Murata and his boss approached Rikidozan to offer their apologies and accept responsibility for the entire situation. Though Rikidozan had initiated the argument and the ensuing violence, he was quick to accept the remorseful gesture. With forgiveness of the incident out of the way, it would have been nice if the story ended there, but it doesn't. Due to Rikidozan's insistence on drinking, he had vastly worsened his condition and would have to undergo surgery a week later. Though initially things seemed like they would be able to be treated, he had unfortunately developed peritonitis. Peritonitis can be a serious and life-threatening condition if left untreated, requiring immediate medical attention and treatment with antibiotics and sometimes surgery. This is a medical condition characterized by inflammation of the peritoneum. the thin tissue lining the inner wall of the abdomen and covering the abdominal organs. It typically occurs due to infection or irritation. Rikidozan died 1 week later on December 15, 1963. Murata was arrested and claimed the attack was in retaliation for Rikidozan insulting him at the nightclub. In 1964, Murata was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 7 years in prison, but in a controversial move, he was paroled after serving just 2 years of his sentence in 1967. His minimal prison sentence fueled rumors of a broader conspiracy behind Rikidozan's death, but Murata was openly remorseful to Rikidozan's family and apologized to his children, as well as visited the resting place of the former champion every year. Decades later, Rikidozan remains a revered figure in Japan, while Murata's legacy is one of infamy as the man who murdered a professional wrestling legend. The crime rocked Japan and signaled the end of an era in Japanese wrestling and entertainment. Though his life was cut short, Rikidozan's impact on Japanese wrestling was monumental. He inspired a generation of wrestlers, including Antonio Inoki and Shohei Giant Baba, who carried on his legacy and took pro wrestling to even greater heights in Japan. Rikidozan will always be known as the father of Puroresu and a national hero whose legend continues today. It's a difficult question to answer, but it's hard to know where to lay the blame of his death. Was it a violent encounter with a knife-wielding enemy? Or was it the weight of the expectations he placed upon himself to give off an invincible aura? Was his need to be seen as the toughest man alive able to hurt him more than any blade ever could?